I signed a prenup 2 weeks before my wedding, thinking it was just paperwork. But 3 days after I moved into his house, I found hidden cameras, a trust fund tied to a child no one would talk about, and proof that the woman before me didn't just leave, she disappeared right after she got pregnant. My name is Althea Vance. I'm 36, and by the time I realized my husband's family didn't want a wife, they wanted an asset, I was already carrying the one thing they would never let me walk away with. Chapter 1. A perfect marriage that never felt like mine. I remember thinking everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look, the kind of wedding people saved and never questioned. The light inside the Drake Hotel was soft and golden, turning every glance into something meaningful. My dress fit perfectly. The room was filled with people who spoke with quiet confidence, and Bradley Thorne stood at the end of the aisle like a man who had never once doubted his place in the world. I was 36, and I told myself I was old enough to recognize the difference between nerves and instinct. What I felt that day, I decided, was just nerves. The reception passed in a blur of smiles and polite congratulations. People told me I was lucky. Catherine Thorne watched everything without seeming to move. She smiled when addressed, but her attention felt sharper than anyone else's, like she was measuring outcomes instead of enjoying the moment. Brad kept his hand at the small of my back all night. It felt grounding. When he leaned in and said everything was perfect, I believed him because I wanted to. It was only after the last guest left that the silence felt different. We moved into his place in the Gold Coast a week later. He called it ours, but everything inside had been chosen long before I existed in it. The furniture was precise, the art curated, nothing out of place. It felt less like a home and more like a finished statement. I told myself I would grow into it. The first real shift came during a quiet dinner, just the two of us, nothing formal. Brad poured wine, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen during the wedding. Then he said I didn't need to rush back to work. He said it like he was lifting something off me. I worked as a senior compliance analyst. My job was built on reading between the lines, spotting risk before it became damage. I knew how systems worked, how control was often hidden behind structure. I told him I liked my job. He reached for my hand and said we were building something bigger now, something that didn't require me to hold on to stress that no longer mattered. It sounded supportive. It sounded reasonable. I didn't answer. 2 days later, Catherine arrived without warning. She moved through the apartment like she belonged there in a way I didn't yet. She adjusted small things, smiled at me as if we shared an understanding I hadn't agreed to. We sat together with coffee, the city quiet outside. She asked about my family, my background, my work. Everything felt polite, controlled, intentional. Then she mentioned my condo. She framed it as a conversation about efficiency, about long-term planning, about how families like theirs protected what mattered. She suggested integrating my property into the family's asset management structure. Brad agreed easily, adding small comments that made it all sound practical. I felt the same quiet pressure I had felt at the wedding, the sense that decisions had already been made, and I was just being invited to agree. I said I needed time. Catherine smiled as if that answer had been expected. She said everything they did was about protecting the family. That word stayed with me. After she left, I asked Brad if this had been planned. He said it wasn't a plan, it was just how things were done. He said it like it was neutral. That night, I pulled out the prenup I had signed 2 weeks before the wedding. At the time, it had felt like a formality. The timeline had been tight, the language dense, and I had trusted that anything serious would have been obvious. I started reading slowly. The first sections felt familiar enough: asset separation, liability, disclosures. Then the language shifted. There were clauses tied to behavior, to alignment with family standards, to actions that could affect reputation. There were provisions that pointed disputes toward arbitration handled within their network. There were phrases that didn't define consequences directly, but made it clear that any conflict would happen on ground they controlled. I read one paragraph 3 times. It wasn't about guaranteeing control in court. It was about making resistance difficult, expensive, draining. It was leverage. I closed the folder and sat there in silence. Celeste Rourke's name came to mind, a lawyer someone had mentioned months earlier, someone who specialized in contracts people signed without fully understanding. I had never needed someone like that before. I picked up my phone, then set it down again. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe this was normal at this level. Maybe this was what stability looked like when it came with money and influence. I wanted that to be true. The next morning, everything looked the same. Brad made coffee, kissed my forehead, asked what I wanted to do. The apartment was still perfect, still quiet, still controlled. But something had shifted inside me. I noticed how often decisions were framed as already shared, how easily my life could be adjusted with language that sounded like care, how natural it felt for my independence to be slowly redefined as something unnecessary. I told myself again that this was just part of building a life with someone. Still, as I stood in the living room later that afternoon, watching the light move across furniture that never needed me, I had a thought that refused to leave. Everything here had already been decided, and I was the only part that hadn't been fully placed yet.
Chapter 2. They were watching me before I knew I was trapped. I started noticing patterns I couldn't unsee. It wasn't one big moment, not at first. It was small shifts that stacked on top of each other until they stopped feeling like coincidence. Brad began asking about my schedule in a way that sounded casual, but he always seemed to know when I had changed something. Catherine's suggestions became more frequent, always framed as help, always timed just after I had made a private decision. A week after I reread the prenup, Brad brought up my job again. He said it would make more sense for me to step back, at least temporarily. He said Thorn Capital Group was going through a sensitive quarter, with an environmental settlement still under review, and the last thing we needed was unnecessary attention. He said it wasn't about control, it was about timing. I asked him how my job had anything to do with his company. He smiled in that careful way of his, the one that softened everything he said without actually changing it. He told me perception mattered, that people connected things whether they should or not. He said my role in compliance could create questions if anyone decided to look too closely. That was the first time it stopped sounding like support. The next day, Serena Holt from HR called me. Her tone was polite, professional, exactly what I would have expected from someone in her position. She said she wanted to check in about my long-term plans given my recent life changes. She mentioned flexibility, then gently suggested that stepping away for a while might align better with where I was now. It was subtle, but I could hear the shift. After I hung up, I opened my work laptop and started reviewing the last few weeks of reports I had handled. I wasn't looking for anything specific at first, just trying to ground myself in something that made sense. Numbers didn't lie the way people did. That was when I saw the first inconsistency. It was buried inside a set of transactions tied to a Delaware entity I didn't recognize. The structure wasn't illegal on its own, but the timing felt off, especially in relation to the environmental settlement Brad had mentioned. The amounts moved in a pattern that suggested something being repositioned, not resolved. I made a note of it, then closed the file. That night, Catherine texted me. She said she had scheduled a routine checkup with her doctor, someone she trusted completely, and thought it would be a good idea for me to establish care there as well. She added that with everything going on, it was important to have the right people looking out for me. I didn't remember asking for a new doctor. I told her I already had one. She replied almost immediately, saying of course it was just a suggestion, but it might be worth meeting Dr. Evelyn Shaw at least once. She said she would have the office reach out to coordinate. I stared at the message longer than I should have. The next afternoon, I heard Brad on the phone in the study. His voice was low, but the apartment carried sound in a way that made privacy feel thinner than it should have been. I wasn't trying to listen, but I caught enough to understand the tone. He said she didn't need to know everything yet. There was a pause. Then he said he would handle it. I stepped back before he came out, moving into the kitchen as if I had been there the whole time. When he walked in, he smiled like nothing had happened. I smiled back. That was when I stopped assuming I would be told the truth. A few days later, I ordered a small device online. It was something I had used once before during a case, a basic RF detector that could pick up signals from hidden transmitters. I told myself I was being cautious, that it was just a way to confirm there was nothing to worry about. When it arrived, I waited until Brad left for work. I started in the living room, moving slowly, not entirely sure what I expected to find. The device stayed quiet at first, then flickered when I passed near the entertainment system. I paused, moved back, watched the signal spike again. I opened the panel. There was nothing obvious, nothing that looked out of place. Still, the signal didn't disappear. I checked the bedroom next. This time, the response was stronger, near one of the wall fixtures that had been installed after I moved in. The system had been upgraded a few days after the wedding. Bran had mentioned it casually. Something about increased security because of ongoing legal exposure. I had accepted it at the time. Now, it felt different. I called Iris. She came over that evening, bringing her laptop and the kind of quiet focus I trusted. She worked in design, but she understood systems, how things connected behind the surface. We moved through the apartment together, checking access points, mapping out what we could. She confirmed what I had already started to suspect. The smart home system had been upgraded recently, and the admin privileges were not assigned to me. There were remote access points that I couldn't trace directly, but they were active. She didn't say the word surveillance. She didn't have to. I asked her if this could be normal. She hesitated, then said it could be explained as security, especially given Brad's family and the kind of risks they managed. But she also said most people were informed when their home systems were changed at that level. I thought about the timing. The upgrade had happened after I moved in, after the wedding, after I signed the prenup. I thanked her and walked her out, telling her I just needed to think. She told me to call her if anything felt off. She said it already sounded off. When I went back inside, the apartment felt smaller. I stood in the center of the living room and looked around, trying to see it the way I had before. The furniture was the same, the lighting unchanged, nothing visibly different, but the feeling had shifted into something I couldn't ignore. I sat down and opened my laptop again, pulling up the notes I had made about the transaction anomalies at Thorn Capital Group. I wasn't ready to connect everything yet, but I couldn't pretend pieces didn't exist. A name came up in one of the threads I had skimmed earlier. Nolan Pierce. I had seen his work before, investigative pieces on financial structures that were technically compliant, but designed to obscure intent. Iris had mentioned him once, said he had been looking into a case tied to real estate holdings and environmental liabilities in Chicago. I closed the file. This wasn't something I could rush. That night, Brad asked what I had done all day. I told him I stayed home. That was true. He kissed my forehead again, the same way he always did, and said I was glad I was taking time to settle in. He said everything would feel more natural soon. I nodded. I didn't tell him about the device, or Iris, or the signal that had spiked in the bedroom. I didn't tell him I had started noticing patterns. Instead, I watched him move through the apartment, comfortable, certain, completely at ease in a space that no longer felt neutral to me. I understood something then that I hadn't been ready to admit before. If I reacted too soon, I would lose whatever advantage I still had. So I did the only thing that made sense. I acted like nothing had changed. But inside, everything had. And for the first time since the wedding, I wasn't trying to fit into the system anymore. I was trying to understand it.
Chapter 3. The Woman Who Disappeared Before Me. Understanding it meant stepping outside of what I had been told and looking at what had been hidden. I didn't start with Brad. I started with his past. Malcolm Reed came recommended through a contact I trusted, someone who had once told me that if I ever needed to know something people were actively trying to bury, Malcolm was the person who could find the edges of it. He had spent years in federal investigations before going private, and he spoke with the kind of restraint that made me believe he didn't waste time on speculation. We met in a quiet coffee shop just off Michigan Avenue, somewhere anonymous enough that no one would think twice about us sitting there. He listened more than he spoke at first. I gave him the version of the situation that felt safest to say out loud. I told him I wanted a background check on Brad, on his business connections, on anything that might be relevant to financial or personal risk. I didn't mention the cameras. I didn't mention the prenup. He nodded once and asked me a single question. Are you looking for confirmation, or are you ready to find something you don't want to see? I held his gaze longer than I expected to. I'm looking for the truth. He didn't react to that. He just wrote something down, closed his notebook, and said he would be in touch. The first update came 3 days later. We met again, this time in his office, a place that felt deliberately plain. No access, no decoration, just files and a desk that had seen too many conversations like this. He slid a thin folder across to me. There's a name you should know, he said. I opened it. Chloe Bennett. The name meant nothing to me at first, just another name and a city full of them. But as I read, the outline began to take shape. She had been involved with Brad in 2019. The timeline overlapped with the early growth phase of Thorn Capital Group's expansion into private real estate funds. She had a background in the arts, worked as a curator, moved in circles that intersected with the kind of donors and investors Brad would have met. Then, suddenly, she disappeared. Relocated to Zurich, no public explanation, no social presence after 2021, no professional footprint that made sense given her prior career trajectory. I looked up at Malcolm. What happened to her? He leaned back slightly, watching me. That's where it gets less clear, he said. There's evidence she left voluntarily. There's also evidence that suggests she didn't have many options. I felt something tighten in my chest. Was she still with Brad when she left? He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. There are indications the relationship ended abruptly, he said, but there's more. He tapped the folder lightly. She was pregnant. The word landed harder than I expected. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The apartment, the cameras, the quiet pressure. It all narrowed down to that single fact. I forced myself to keep reading. There were medical records, partial, incomplete, enough to suggest prenatal care had started in Chicago before she left the country. Then the trail shifted. Zurich. A private clinic. Limited access to records. I swallowed. Do we know what happened to the child? Malcolm didn't answer immediately. At first glance, it looks like she had the baby and kept it, he said. There are references to a child connected to her name. At first glance, I repeated. He nodded. That's the surface level. It's what you find if you stop digging early. I didn't stop. What happens if you don't? He opened another file. A trust was established in 2020. Delaware entity, layered structure. The beneficiary is a minor. The timing aligns with the birth. My mind started moving faster than I could control. Is Brad connected to it? Malcolm met my eyes. Indirectly. The trust is managed through a network tied to Thorn Capital Group. The name Victor Lang comes up repeatedly. Victor Lang, the CFO. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the shape of what this was becoming. So, the child is... what? Provided for? I asked.
Financially, yes, very well provided for. And Chloe? That's where it gets complicated. He slid another page toward me. There's almost no record of her involvement after 2021. No legal filings, no disputes, no financial transfers that would indicate direct support outside of the trust structure. I stared at the page. That doesn't make sense. No, he agreed. It doesn't. Silence settled between us for a moment. Is it possible she gave the child up? I asked. It's possible, he said. It's also possible the situation was structured in a way that made that the only viable option. I didn't need him to say more than that. I left his office with the folder in my bag and a weight in my chest that felt heavier with every step. On the way home, I called Iris. I need you to look at something, I said. She didn't ask questions, just told me to come over. Her apartment felt like the opposite of mine. Lived in, imperfect, real. I spread the documents across her table, watching her face as she read through them. She went quiet halfway through. This isn't just messy, she said finally. This is controlled. I nodded. There's a trust, I said, set up right after the birth, managed through Brad's network. She looked up at me. And the mother just disappears from the structure? That's what it looks like. Iris leaned back, crossing her arms. That's not normal, Althea. Even in complicated custody situations, there's a trail. Legal filings, disputes, something. There's nothing, I said. She studied me for a moment. What are you really asking? I didn't answer right away. Then I said it out loud. What if she didn't have a choice? The room felt smaller after that. Later that night, I sat alone in the apartment, the same apartment that now felt like a space I was observing instead of living in. Brad was still at work. The city lights reflected off the windows, turning the glass into a mirror I couldn't fully see through. I opened my laptop and searched for anything I could find about Chloe Bennett. There were old photos, gallery openings, articles that mentioned her in passing, then nothing. It was like someone had drawn a line through her life. I closed the laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. My mind kept circling the same thought. This had happened before. Whatever the system was, whatever rules it operated under, Chloe had been part of it, and then she had been removed from it. I stood up and walked to the bathroom without thinking. I had been ignoring the signs for days, the subtle shifts in my body, the way certain things felt different. I didn't believe that anymore. The test sat in my hand longer than it should have. I watched the result appear slowly, as if time itself had decided to stretch just enough to make sure I understood what I was about to see. 2 lines. Clear, unmistakable. I set it down on the counter and stared at it. For a moment, there was nothing else. Not Brad, not Catherine, not the trust, or Chloe, or the cameras. Just the realization that everything I just learned didn't belong to the past anymore. It was about to happen again. I looked at my reflection, trying to recognize the person staring back at me. The same thought kept repeating, louder each time. If they knew, I wouldn't be a wife. I wouldn't even be a person. I would be part of the system they had already built.
Chapter 4. The Meeting They Didn't Expect. I parked a block away from the office and sat in the car for a minute longer than I needed to, my hands resting on the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the glass building ahead. Nothing about it looked unusual. Just another law office in downtown Asheville, clean lines, neutral tones, the kind of place where decisions get made quietly and permanently. I picked up the envelope from the passenger seat, feeling the weight of the documents inside, then stepped out of the car. The walk to the entrance felt shorter than it should have. Or maybe I just wasn't hesitating anymore. Inside, the air was cool, controlled, the receptionist looking up with a practiced smile. I gave my name.
She nodded like she had been expecting me. "Mr. Brennan is ready for you." Of course he was. She led me down a hallway lined with closed doors, then stopped at one near the end and knocked lightly before opening it. The room was already occupied. My father was sitting at the table, leaning back slightly, one hand resting on the arm of his chair like he had settled into a position he expected to hold. Meredith sat beside him, her posture tight, her expression carefully neutral, though I could see the tension in the way her fingers were clasped together. Across from them sat Richard Brennan, a folder open in front of him, his attention shifting toward me as I entered. All three of them turned at the same time. For a second, no one spoke. Then my father gave a small nod, like I had just arrived where I was supposed to be. "Elowen." I didn't respond to the tone. I walked to the empty chair across from them and sat down, placing my envelope on the table in front of me, but not opening it yet. Brennan cleared his throat slightly, his voice measured. "Thank you for coming in. I believe you received the document regarding the Lake Lure property." I did. He nodded, sliding a paper slightly forward. "We're simply looking to finalize the transfer so the sale can proceed without complication." The word "simply" almost made me smile. My father leaned forward a little. "This doesn't need to be difficult." I looked at him, really looked at him, noticing the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the tension in his jaw. "You're asking me to give up any claim I might have on a property you say I don't even care about." He didn't hesitate. Exactly. There it was. Clean, direct, certain. I let a small breath out. Not quite a laugh, not quite anything else. "You're right about one thing." He leaned back again, confident. "I didn't go back to that house." I paused just long enough for the silence to settle. "Because the last time I was there, you insulted my husband in front of everyone." Meredith shifted slightly in her chair. My father's expression tightened. "This isn't about that." "It is for me." Brennan glanced between us, his attention sharpening slightly. My father shook his head. "You're holding on to things that don't matter. This is business." I held his gaze. "You're the one who made it that way." Meredith finally spoke, her voice quieter than I expected. "Elowen, we don't have time for this. We just need you to sign so we can move forward." There was an edge under her words, something tighter than frustration. Pressure. I looked at her. "For what?" She blinked. "For the sale. For the house." "No. For what?" She didn't answer immediately. My father stepped in. "You know exactly what this is for. We're trying to resolve a situation." That word again. Resolve. Like it was temporary, like it would fix itself if I just cooperated. I leaned back slightly, my hands resting loosely on the table. "You're not resolving anything. You're trying to survive your own mistake." The room went quiet. Brennan's pen stopped moving. Meredith's eyes snapped toward me. My father's expression shifted, just for a second, something cracking beneath the surface before it settled again. "You don't know what you're talking about." I didn't argue. I reached forward, opened the envelope, and slid the documents out on the table, so Brennan could see them first. He leaned in slightly, his eyes moving across the page, scanning, then slowing, then stopping. The change was immediate. Subtle, but unmistakable. His posture straightened, his expression sharpened. He picked up the document, reading more carefully now. No one else spoke. My father looked at him, waiting. "What is that?" Brennan didn't answer right away. He turned another page, then another, his focus narrowing. Meredith glanced between them, her fingers tightening. "Richard." My father's voice carried a warning now. Brennan finally looked up. "Where did you get this?" I met his gaze. It was left to me. He looked back down at the document, then at my father. "This property is held in an irrevocable trust." The words landed slowly, like they needed time to settle. My father frowned a little. "What does that mean?" "It means the property is not in your name. It hasn't been since it was transferred into the trust." Silence filled the room. Meredith shook her head slightly. That doesn't make sense. It was always Grandpa's house. It went to Dad. Brennan's voice stayed calm. It did not go through probate. It was transferred before your grandfather passed. Legally, it does not belong to your father. I watched the moment it registered. Not fully, not completely, but enough. My father's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. That's not possible. It is documented, recorded, and binding. Brennan set the paper down carefully. Any sale would require authorization from the beneficiary. He looked at me. My father followed his gaze, his expression no longer controlled. Elowen! It wasn't my name the way he said it before. It was something else now, something uncertain. You're saying you own the house? I held his gaze, steady. I'm saying you never did. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Meredith leaned back slightly, her face draining of color. This is some kind of mistake. It's not. My father stood up abruptly, the movement sharp. This doesn't change anything. We can fix this. Brennan didn't move. There is nothing to fix. The ownership is clear. My father looked at him, then back at me, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. You're going to sign anyway. It wasn't a question. It was a habit. I shook my head once. No. The words settled into the room with a finality I hadn't felt before. No anger, no hesitation, just no. Brennan closed the folder in front of him slowly, his expression neutral now, professional. I would advise against proceeding with any sale discussions until this matter is fully addressed. My father didn't respond. He was still looking at me, trying to understand how something he had assumed for years had shifted in a single moment. Meredith leaned back slightly, her composure slipping. The room felt smaller now, tighter, like everything that had been certain when I walked in had been quietly taken apart. I gathered my documents, sliding them back into the envelope, my movements calm, deliberate. No one tried to stop me. No one told me to wait. I stood up, the chair moving back softly against the floor. For a second, I looked at them, at the people who had spent years deciding who I was supposed to be, and I realized something simple. They had never actually known. I turned and walked toward the door, the sound of my footsteps steady, the space behind me silent. This time, I didn't feel like I was leaving. I felt like I had finally arrived.
Chapter 5. I didn't walk away. I made them lose everything. I didn't start by fighting them. I started by learning how they worked. For years, my job had been about understanding systems that looked clean on the surface but hid risk underneath. Thorn Capital Group was no different. The only difference was that this time, I was inside it. Signing the post-nuptial agreement gave me access. Not control, but enough visibility to see how everything connected, how money moved, how decisions were protected, how pressure was applied without ever looking like force. Brad watched me sign with visible relief. Catherine said nothing, just gave a small nod. They thought I had chosen alignment. That was when I called Nolan Pierce. He already knew the name Thorn Capital Group. He had been following threads tied to their environmental settlement. When I told him I had information connecting internal financial structures to that case, he went quiet. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked. "I'm already in it," I said. We met that night. I gave him just enough. Shell companies tied to Delaware registrations, fund movements that didn't match public filings, Victor Lang's role in structuring it. If this connects, this isn't just a bad look. This is regulatory exposure. That's the idea, I replied. While Nolan built his case, I went back to Malcolm. I needed the full truth about Chloe. He didn't have everything, but he had enough. She had tried to push back, quietly, through legal channels that never fully materialized. Then came the agreement. Not a clear custody battle, not something public, something controlled.
something structured to make resistance impossible. She didn't lose the child in court, he said. She lost the ability to fight for him. That stayed with me. They didn't take things. They made it impossible to keep them. When I got home, Brad was waiting. "We need to talk," he said. I sat across from him. "About what?" "About what you've been doing." I held his gaze. "What do you think I've been doing?" "My mom thinks you're digging into things that don't concern you." "Everything here concerns me," I said. "This isn't how this works," he snapped. "No, it's exactly how it works. I just didn't understand it before." He leaned forward. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "For who?" He didn't answer. I stood and walked toward the window. "I knew about Chloe," I said. He didn't deny it. "It wasn't the same," he said quietly. "She was pregnant, she disappeared, there's a trust for a child she doesn't have. Tell me what part of that is different." "You don't understand everything," he said. "Then explain it." He couldn't. That was enough. The first article came out 3 days later. It wasn't explosive, just questions, discrepancies in how Thorn Capital Group handled their environmental settlement, enough to make investors uneasy. Then came the second piece. More detail, names, Victor Lang mentioned directly, the trust structures hinted at. That was when everything started to move. Investors asked questions, legal teams scrambled, pressure built quietly but steadily. Catherine called me the next morning. "Have you seen the news?" she asked. "I have." "And you have nothing to say about it?" "I'm not involved in your company's decisions." Silence. "We brought you into this family. You tried to absorb me into a system. That's not the same thing. You're making a mistake. I'm correcting one." The fallout didn't happen all at once. It never does. Regulators opened an inquiry. Investors pulled back. Internal cracks started to show. Victor Lang stepped down. Brad was removed from operations pending review. Catherine lost control in ways only someone inside could see. The timing of decisions, the shift in tone, the way certainty turned into reaction. The system wasn't gone, but it wasn't untouchable anymore. The last time I saw Brad, he came to the apartment unannounced. I let him in. He looked different. Not broken, but uncertain in a way I had never seen before. "We can fix this," he said. I didn't respond. "I can talk to my mom. We can restructure things." "This isn't about restructuring," I said. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." "Then how far was it supposed to go?" I asked. He had no answer. "I loved you," he finally said. I nodded. "I believe you." He looked surprised. "But you still chose a system over me, and that's not something you can undo." He stepped closer. "Don't walk away." I picked up my bag. "I'm not walking away," I said. "I'm stepping out of something that was never mine." I left without taking anything. I didn't need to. What kept me mattered more. My name, my choices, my control. For the first time since the wedding, I felt clear. People think control is obvious, that it shows itself in big moments. It doesn't. It builds slowly, through small decisions, through things that sound reasonable, until one day you realize you're the only part of your life you no longer recognize. If you've ever felt that shift, if you've ever questioned whether your life still belongs to you, then you already understand more than you think. And if you want more stories like this, the kind that show what control really looks like beneath the surface, stay with me.